Okay, welcome back. In this video, we'll be talking about classical and operant conditioning, two topics that can be a little bit tough to kind of keep straight and organized, in my head at least. So hopefully this will be a good overview of both. And so basically we'll start just by talking about associative learning very generally, and then we'll get into each type of conditioning. And so in the previous video, we've covered learning, right? Basically acquiring new and enduring information or behaviors. And classical and operant conditioning are both types of associative learning, in which we basically learn associations or we learn to associate various sequences of events. So, one example, if you're not really into pop culture, didn't grow up with TV or anything like that, these might not resonate with you. But for a quick example, let's see if this makes you think of something. Okay, if so, you might know what it is. If not, you might have no idea. This is the theme song from the movie Jaws, classic old shark movie, worth a watch if you've never seen it. That's a theme song, and when I do this in person, a lot of times like students will hear one or two notes of that and immediately think of Jaws. For another example, let's see if this makes you think of something. So if you don't know, that is the McDonald's theme song, right? So you might already be able to tell this is something that's very powerful in advertising, in the fun corporate materialistic capitalist world of today. Um, so yeah, just a couple examples to demonstrate what we mean, in that we're learning to form associations, or we learn these basic associations where if we hear certain sounds, it makes us think of something. Or even in your own life, you might have those instances where you get some random smell or hear a song, especially like songs that we listened to when we were kind of in the adolescent teenage years. And it might bring back like waves of emotion that put you back in that place. Like, for example, when I was a kid, my grandma always wore a certain kind of perfume. And one time when I was a student in college, I smelled that perfume when I got into the elevator, and I immediately was like back in my grandma's house as a kid because the smell was that powerful of an association that I had learned. And so, some basic terms here: stimuli are what we respond to. A stimulus is something out in the environment that elicits some sort of respondent behavior. And so, we'll talk about both these types here, classical and operant. Let's start with classical conditioning. And so, in this form of learning, we are basically learning to associate stimuli in our environment. In this case, we'll stick to two. We're learning to associate two stimuli and anticipate some kind of event, or we have some response or behavior to those stimuli. And so, for example, lightning and thunder, right, usually go together. And so, if we see lightning, sound or light travels faster than sound. And so, we see the lightning, and then there's a little bit of a delay, and then there's the thunderclap, right? The sound of thunder. And if it's really loud, we might like wince or just kind of jump. And then after enough repetition, when we see lightning, we might kind of wince a little bit and anticipate, okay, the thunder's coming. That's a basic example of classical conditioning, and we'll sort of break down how that process works through this. And to start, I know we haven't gotten into the nitty gritty and we haven't even touched operant conditioning. But if it helps keep you organized, this is something that helps me keep organized at least, so I hope it might help you. So in classical conditioning, we're talking about the learning of a response or behavior to stimuli in our environment, right? So that's the classical piece. And then later on, when we get to operant, we'll be talking about how our behavior will elicit or yield certain consequences. Things can be rewarded, things can be punished. And then that's also an aspect of conditioning and learning. So for now, let's stick to this piece, the stimulus and the response. Have you ever heard of that Pavlov guy? If not, maybe this rings a bell. It's a terrible joke. Um, but if not, maybe this will help. This is a video that is in Canvas for you. It's a clip from the TV show The Office. Um, yeah, and I'll let you kind of explore that. Basically, if you're familiar with The Office, Jim classically conditions Dwight to salivate at the sound of his computer rebooting. And that's in that clip. The reason I show it is because Jim mentions the scientist that I learned about in school who trained a dog to salivate at the sound of a bell, and that was this guy Pavlov. Um, yeah, I normally don't like highlight specific researchers and psychologists that much in this class, but I would like to mention this because it's kind of inserted its way into pop culture, and it's relevant exactly to what we're talking about here. So he's known for his experiments with dogs. Basically, what he did was he kind of created this weird-looking apparatus to hold the dog in place, and then he basically hooked up a tube to the dog's mouth to measure exactly, or as much as he could, to measure exactly how much the dog was salivating. Right, so you could tell if the dog was salivating, which dogs do in response to food. And he used that to see if he could train a dog to salivate to things other than food, right? To kind of teach the dog, um, without really knowing it, teach the dog classical conditioning. And so we'll kind of walk through the steps that Pavlov did. There are some important terms to remember here. Stimulus and response. Stimulus is just something in the environment that evokes a response of something that we respond to. Like, for example, if your phone vibrates or goes off, right, you respond to it. You're like, oh, I got a message or a phone call. And then the response would be the behavior that you do in response to that, right? So, for example, if I'm sitting there, my phone vibrates, and then I like kind of jump up and then grab my phone, right? That's an example of a stimulus and a response. Conditioned and unconditioned, these terms I think are what throw people off the most. You can think of conditioning as learning. So basically, if something's conditioned, it means it's learned. It's something you had to be taught. Unconditioned means unlearned. It's something we naturally do. Like, for example, a dog salivating to food or in the presence of food is an unlearned response, right? That's something a dog is naturally doing. And so, to walk through the steps of Pavlov's experiment, so before conditioning occurs, there is this unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. So the dog salivates when presented with food. If you have pets or you spend time around dogs, you know that. And so here it's unconditioned because the dog didn't need to learn that. It has an unlearned response of salivating to the unlearned stimulus of food, right? That's something that dogs innately are going to do. And before this experiment, there would be some neutral stimulus that does not yield a response, right? Neutral basically means, yeah, neutral here just basically means that there's no response to it, or there's not the response of interest, right? So if you're not familiar with tuning forks, they look like this. Basically, back in the days before we had modern tuning devices, if you wanted to like tune an instrument, you could have some like a metal thing this shape, and then you kind of hit the side of it with another piece of metal or a chime or something, and then it would make a specific noise that would correspond to a specific note. Right, so if I'm tuning my guitar to an E, I might have an E tuning fork that makes an E pitch noise. And so if you do that, if you hit a tuning fork and make that noise, the dog might perk its ears up and look, but it's not going to salivate here. So this is a neutral stimulus because it does not yield the specific response we're interested in, of salivation in this case. And then during the process of conditioning, essentially we pair these two things together. The NS is the neutral stimulus, the US is the unconditioned stimulus. We pair those together, and then we will yield an unconditioned response, right? Because with or without the tuning fork, the dog's going to salivate when presented with food. And so now what we're doing is we're just combining the two to form an association, right? That's the associative learning piece. And the important thing is that the tuning fork needs to come right before the food, right? So we hit the tuning fork, make that sound, and then immediately present the dog with food. And then the goal is that over time, the dog will learn that the tuning fork noise is going to be associated with food, and therefore will salivate to the tuning fork by itself. And then after conditioning, if you do this enough times, then we will see a change, right? Where we can hit the tuning fork and the dog will immediately start salivating. And so now the neutral stimulus has become a conditioned stimulus, and it yields a conditioned response. So in other words, now the dog has learned to respond with salivating to the learned stimulus of that noise of the tuning fork. Yeah, so there's those if you need a refresher. In class, we would do an exercise where we would watch that clip from The Office again, and then I would have you go through this and try to identify what the unconditioned stimulus, the response, so on and so forth are. Um, I have that in Canvas for you though, so we're not going to spend time on that here. Um, in terms of how this can be applied or how you might see this applied in your life, honestly, one of the most common unfortunate ways is in advertising in modern culture. And so we can look back in ads in the past, like for example, if you've heard of the Marlboro Man, used to have cigarette ads in like magazines all over the place. And the Marlboro Man was basically a way for tobacco companies to associate cigarettes with masculinity, right? This idea that like masculine cowboys smoke cigarettes, therefore you should too. Something that's still present today in various other forms of tobacco. Um, Ironically, several Marlboro men died, I think, due to lung cancer, something that the tobacco companies did not necessarily want to talk about. But kind of one example there. Sex is also that. Whoops. Sex is also something that commonly you see in advertising. The whole idea that sex sells, right? So if you drink Genesee beer, that means that attractive women are just going to be all over you, evidently. Um, yeah, and so various slogans, campaigns, any sort of branding, really. That's what's being done here. Um, and yeah, UAF institutions, educational institutions do this stuff too, right? They kind of build a brand, this association, this idea that specific universities have a certain sort of culture and flavor that you should want to be a part of. Chevy like a rock, yeah, yeah, we don't need to spend too much time on these. Again, it still happens with tobacco, may cause the urge to act like a man, right? Saying that if you do this, then you're just going to be the manliest man around. Um, Evidently, women can't use this tobacco, according to the advertising. Coca-Cola, yeah, one thing I personally hate is how holidays in this country, any sort of celebration like that, corporations have kind of built this culture in which holidays are associated with various products and things like that. Um, yeah, so yeah, just some examples there. Again, institutions do this, so if you want to, you can go back and click on these links. UAF has commercials. Notre Dame, yeah, I grew up rooting for the Irish football team. Two of my brothers went to school there. They also have this stuff, and most universities have their own form of brand that they try to sell in a way. Um, Fun fact about advertising: the whole idea of coffee breaks is something that was invented by the Maxwell House Corporation. And it was actually invented by a psychologist, right? Some people in psychology are sellouts or have been sellouts. And he's responsible for working with Maxwell House to popularize the idea of coffee breaks and therefore increase Maxwell House's market share, right? So it's something that corporations have used to their advantage. Another example of classical conditioning in your life is taste aversion. And so what this means is, I imagine many of you have some food or drink or something that the mere thought of it makes you nauseous because you've had a bad experience. For me, it's this thing right here, Hershey's milkshake. Many of you maybe have never heard of these. I don't know if they made it up to Alaska. Um, these are something that I saw when I was a kid. Like if I stopped at like the corner store or a gas station or something, and my brothers and I would often bike home from school, and there was a gas station there that we would stop by. And yeah, I remember one day they had these, and I was so excited, and so I bought one, and I absolutely loved it. And then I did that a few more times over that year, and then one day I drank one, and then just got violently sick afterward. I don't know if it was that or something else, but now like the mere thought of it makes me nauseous, so I don't want to look at this picture any more than I have to. Um, but a lot of people argue that this is some sort of evolutionary or adaptive response, and that if you think about, yeah, as humans have sort of evolved and become more familiar with natural environments, it would be important to know which foods we could eat and not eat, right? If you eat a certain kind of berry and uh, your buddy dies, right, or you get really sick, it's probably important that you learn the lesson not to consume that food again, right? So that's kind of one way our own sort of physiological systems have this like classical conditioning response built into them when it comes to food and taste. Phobias are another example of this intense fear we might have due to certain stimuli can take lots of different forms, like spiders, for example, bugs, anything like that. Um, yeah, and so one way that this can be applied kind of in reverse is in treating phobias, right? So, for example, there's something called exposure therapy and this idea of systematic desensitization. Basically, the idea that if you have an intense fear of something that's not to say your emotions aren't valid or something, but it might not necessarily be the most practical or reasonable response to it, right? And that, like, for example, if someone's deathly afraid of, let's say, elevators, right? Maybe they've had a bad experience, maybe they just don't like them for some reason, maybe they feel claustrophobic. But say that they live in like I don't know New York City and they work on the 50th floor of a building, they're probably not going to be able to avoid elevators, so they need to learn to manage this intense fear. And so through systematic desensitization or slowly and methodically exposing people to that stimulus, they can essentially reduce that intense conditioned response of fear and replace it with a response that is less extreme emotion. Um, yeah, so basically changing the conditioned fear response from fear to calm. I think, yeah, some examples how this is done with dogs. I have videos. I forget where they're at. They might just be in Canvas, but I have an example video of that of a woman who is intensely and deathly afraid of birds to the point where she can't even be in the same room as a feather. And so it's a video of her. It's a quick one of her getting exposure therapy to treat and reduce that intense fear response. So something to think about is various stimuli you're conditioned to respond to. I think cell phones are a big one. And even in the world today, if we ever have a dull moment, a lot of people just immediately pull out their phone without realizing it. If you've ever tried to delete an app from your phone, like say you want to cut back on social media, so you delete like TikTok or something, you might find yourself for the next week or so randomly pulling out your phone and hitting your screen exactly where that app used to be because it's just a conditioned response. Videos, these all live in Canvas, just some examples of classical conditioning. But now let's talk about operant conditioning, right? And so going back to this, classical conditioning is just the stimulus and the response we have to it. Operant conditioning has to do with how our behavior is rewarded or punished, or in other words, how our behavior is influenced by our environment, right? That's operant conditioning. So a quick video here. Let me make sure the volume's on. Hopefully this isn't too loud. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm playing with the volume. I was trying to turn it down. Let me get back to it. Okay, we can stop it there. So if you, let me turn that down. If you're not familiar with what just happened, so that was a can opener, like for opening a can of cat food. And these cats have learned that that sound means that there is going to be some delicious food waiting for them, right? So they come and immediately start meowing. If you have pets, you probably have some experience with something like that. And so what this is a form of learning in which we learn voluntary behaviors, so behaviors of our own volition, and we learn those behaviors through the consequences that they cause. And I really hate the term operant conditioning because the word operant isn't very intuitive to me, or I think most people in this context at least. And so what it's referring to is this idea of operant behavior or behavior that operates on our environment to produce consequences. And there's a lot to keep straight here. So a key thing right off the bat is that basically what we're saying is that we behave in certain ways, and the environment either tells us to continue doing that behavior, so it will try to increase it, or it tells us to stop doing that behavior, or in other words, it's telling us to decrease it, right? And I always have this picture, and I can never remember the point. Oh, like maybe speeding. So this looks like someone speeding. Yeah, looking at their speedometer, they're probably going pretty damn fast. Um, So speeding, for example, getting a speeding ticket is a form of a consequence. In that case, it's a form of punishment, right? Because the police are trying to decrease the behavior of speeding in the name of public safety, right? So a very basic example of a consequence. Yeah, there you go. It was speeding. Good guess. Okay, and so basically, yeah, this goes back to this one researcher and this law of effects. Basically, they would put cats in this puzzle box, and their goal was to escape the box, and then they would get rewarded with food, with fish, and basically observe that if they rewarded this behavior of escaping the puzzle box, then they would tend to do it each time, and they would tend to get better at it and faster at responding that way because of the reward that was coming, right? And so this is applied in all kinds of animal training. Um, B.F. Skinner, again, I mentioned here because his work is relevant to this specifically. Um, he did a lot of work. He was a hardcore behaviorist, so focused just on observable behavior, and worked a lot with pigeons. And so I think I'll have a video at the end of pigeons. Um, but he even taught pigeons to play like his own version of ping pong with each other, just basically like a table with a ball on it, and they would peck back and forth. And he taught them to do this simply through reinforcing various behaviors. And also, yeah, Skinner boxes is something that's been used in the past. Animal research, I know, has a whole ethical discussion around it. But just to present a brief example here, early behaviorist work sometimes worked with mice in these little Skinner boxes. And so basically, they would have to push a bar to get some sort of reward, and researchers would observe how they increase that behavior as a result of being rewarded. Okay, and so basically in operant conditioning, this is having to do with changes in our behavior frequency. And so if a behavior is reinforced, it's going to increase, right? The goal of reinforcement is to increase behavior. Like, for example, if you do great work on an assignment, and I give you like 5 points extra credit, and I'm like, keep up the great work, this was phenomenal. What I'm trying to do, whether consciously or unconsciously, is increase the behavior of applying yourself and doing great work. On the other hand, if, yeah, like for example, when I was a kid, I think I've told this story before, in preschool, I took a truck from someone because I wanted to play with it, and that behavior was punished, and I was sent to timeout because my teacher was trying to decrease the behavior of taking things that weren't mine, right? And so this happens especially in, um, yeah, in like schools and like any sort of caregiving with children, because we're trying to help children, shape children into being responsible, caring individuals that look after one another rather than individuals who try to exploit or take from others. And this part, I think, can get a little bit confusing. So, some shortcuts to help you understand this. If the behavior results in, oh yeah, let's start on this one actually. So basically, are we trying to increase or decrease a behavior, right? Are you more or less likely to repeat that behavior? If we're trying to increase it, that's reinforcement. If we're trying to decrease it, that's punishment. And the consequences can kind of be thought of in two ways. Sometimes things are added to our environment. Sometimes things are removed from our environment. If we're adding something, the term there is positive, right? If we're removing something, the term is negative. And we'll go through examples to illustrate exactly what I mean here. But one table that I think we'll come back to that might help here is basically, are we adding or removing something? And is that thing that we're adding or removing pleasant and desired, or unpleasant or undesired, right? So for example, if we are um, adding something that is desired, right? So we add something desired, like say, for example, again, you submit a great assignment, you've done great work, and I give you 5 points of extra credits for the fact that you did great work. That is an example of positive reinforcement. I'm trying to increase your desired behavior of doing great work. However, if I add something unpleasant, like say, for example, yeah, you submit something late, right? And so I am, yeah, and this can kind of be thought of in two ways. But say I add a late penalty, right? That could be considered positive punishment because I'm trying to decrease the undesired behavior of submitting things late, right? Just kind of some examples there. So punishment, again here, punishment, we're trying to decrease a behavior. And positive punishment, positive means we're adding something with the goal of decreasing a behavior, therefore we're adding something unpleasant. Like for example, adding chores, right? If kids are acting up and we say, all right, you're gonna have to clean the house when you get home or sweep the floors or something, right? That's an example of positive punishment because we're trying to decrease behavior by adding something that is undesired, such as extra chores. Corporal punishment, yeah, in my high school, again, grew up Catholic, we had nuns teach us. They didn't hit us with rulers, but I'm sure they did in the past and just couldn't anymore. In fact, I think some said that. But that's an example of positive punishment too. If I'm talking to my friend in class and I get swatted with a ruler, that is positive punishment. Negative punishment then, here negative means we're removing something, right? Key thing there, positive is adding, negative is removing. Here, negative punishment, we're removing something. And if we're trying to decrease behavior, that means we're removing something that that person wants or that is desired or pleasant. Like for example, if I don't know, in high school or something, and I sneak out without my parents knowing. I go hang out with my friends. I don't know. I do something I'm not supposed to, and my parents pay for my phone and they take it away. That's an example of negative punishment. Trying to decrease that behavior, punish that by removing something that I want. Timeout is another version of this, right? And like basically, like if I'm playing with my friends and I'm not playing nicely, and so I have to go sit in timeout, that behavior is being punished. The behavior of not playing nicely is being punished by removing play at all, right? Instead, I have to just sit there and watch my friends play or stare in the corner. And an important thing to note here is that sometimes these can be thought of in both ways. Like some people might say, isn't that positive punishment though? Because they're adding the undesired activity of staring at a wall. That's fair. And these things aren't always neat and tidy, but I'd still like you to kind of get the basic concepts of negative, positive punishment reinforcement. So some examples that you can guess here. If I am raising my child and they're not playing nicely, so I take away their toys, is that negative or positive punishment? What do you think? The answer is negative punishment, removing something desired to punish that behavior. So some kids get allowance from their parents, right? And say my kid has just been acting up all week, so I take away their allowance. Is that negative or positive punishment? That would be negative punishment because again, removing something desired. Yeah, I don't love the fact that people do this. Not really my cup of tea. But say, for example, yeah, my dogs, one pooped on the floor, one ate it, and so I add this public shame. Would that be positive or negative? Answer, positive punishment, right? What I just say, I'm adding something undesired. Shame, right? Shame, yeah, I guess it's a good motivator. It's motivating, but it's probably not the best tactic as a parent. The classic example of touching a hot stove. And so we touch the hot stove, that burns us, and we're learning not to do that again. Is that positive or negative punishment? That is, ding, 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 positive punishment, right? Adding the burn, the pain to decrease that behavior. However, I should mention, right, some of y'all might be parents now or in the future. So I would like to mention punishment is not the ideal way to motivate behavior or to change behavior. It might work in the short term, but it doesn't mean people forget. So behaviors can be suppressed, not forgotten. Sometimes it just causes fear of the person doing the punishing, right? And that we're not really learning not to do that behavior. We're just learning not to do it around that person or when they can see. And we're also like damaging that relationship, right? Adding very negative, or yeah, I shouldn't use negative in this context because that's confusing. Adding aversive components to that relationship. Damaging is a better word there. Damaging the relationship. Yeah, and like I said, can just discriminate when and where they can get away with the behavior, right? Like if um, yeah, like if I'm talking a lot in class or something and one teacher harps on me and another doesn't, then I might just learn, okay, I can't do it in this class, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to do it in the other class, right? And so worth noting that if it is used, effective punishment should immediately follow the wrong behavior and be consistent, right? Like if I'm training a dog and I come home and they got into the trash and I don't know when it was that day, punishing them then, punishing them then honestly isn't really going to do anything because you don't know how long it's been since they actually got into the trash, right? Um, Whereas if you see them do it and you immediately punish them for it or scold them, that might be more useful. Again, wouldn't recommend corporal punishment or anything, but even just saying like no, um, they should immediately follow that behavior and it should be consistent, meaning that every time you see them do that, you should be following the same plan of action in terms of behavior modification. And ideally, this should also be paired with reinforcement of the right behavior, right? So in other words, rather than just punishing that behavior, basically help them to discriminate between what is wrong and what is right. Like for example, if I'm working with kids in a preschool, using myself as an example again, if I see a kid take a truck or a toy from another person, I might like scold them for that, tell them they can't do that, but then immediately reinforce the behavior of sharing, right? So that's an example of how this should be done effectively. But again, lots of evidence that reinforcement is better. So if punishment is ever implemented, it really should be paired with reinforcement because it's just a better way to, um, yeah, to change behavior, and also it's going to be less damaging to those relationships. So to talk about reinforcement, again, positive, we're adding something. So in positive reinforcement, we are adding something pleasant to try to increase behavior. Guess what? If you get a paycheck, that's exactly what that is, right? Paying you to reinforce the behavior of doing your job, or if you get a bonus or something like that. Negative reinforcement, this one always trips people up. Negative reinforcement is not punishment, right? Reinforcement means that we are trying to increase a desired behavior. Negative just means that we are taking something away. So in this case, we are removing, like in seatbelts, for example. You get in the car, the seatbelt buzzer's going off and won't shut up until you put your seatbelt on. That's negative reinforcement because it's trying to get you to wear your seatbelt by like, this kind of goes both ways, I guess, but it's trying to reinforce the behavior of wearing your seatbelt by getting rid of that horrible buzzer sound once you actually put the seatbelt on. So some examples, giving a dog a treat, positive or negative reinforcement. That is positive reinforcement, adding something desired. Yeah, the alarm clock goes off and then you have to get out of bed to turn it off. So we're trying to reinforce the behavior of waking up. Is this negative or positive? Here, this is negative because when you hit the alarm, it is, yeah, your behavior is removing something from the environment, right? Something undesirable like the alarm clock. Say I'm a teacher, I'm just on my last one tier. I have nothing left. I'm exhausted. And so I'm just like, you know what? You're supposed to have homework this weekend, and I'll just get rid of it if you behave for the rest of the day. Please, for the love of all things holy, just behave. Is that negative or positive reinforcement? Here it's negative, right? Removing the aversive thing that is weekend homework. Giving kids allowance rather than taking it away. Positive reinforcement, right? So once again, a table to help you keep it organized. I hope this is helpful. And then in class, I would have you go through these in groups, just kind of identifying if these are positive or negative, and if they are reinforcement or punishment. Um, yeah, so something that you can certainly work through if you'd like. Some various other examples, superstitious behaviors. Um, when we falsely associate a behavior with a reward. Like, for example, if, I don't know, say I don't have too many superstitions. Say, for example, I had like a lucky hat, right? And every time I take a test, I have to wear my lucky hat. And one day I forget my lucky hat and I just can't take the test. I'm like terribly afraid that I'm going to fail. That's an example of a superstitious behavior. Really, the hat I'm wearing does not have that much impact on how I perform on tests. But nonetheless, through enough time and repetition, we might build a strong association that it will. And shaping is simply something that's an aspect of operant conditioning in which we reinforce behaviors gradually to get someone closer to a desired behavior. So this is common in things like animal training. So one quick video here. This is B.F. Skinner shaping a pigeon to move in a circle.
And we're going to try another pigeon now.
Let me turn that up.
Try to pick out some particular pattern of behavior and make it a more frequent part of the repertoire of the bird. Very fine. This bird has been already conditioned to eat when the magazine sounds and the light flashes. Now we'll just watch its behavior a bit. It's not doing anything in particular, you see, but I'm going to try to get it to do something. Suppose I shape up the behavior of making a complete turn. What I do is simply, as I did then, to wait for some part of that behavior. There's more of it, you see. You can see that the effect is instantaneous. I'm waiting for it to turn counterclockwise now. And then I reinforce that movement. And I wait for a more pronounced movement than that. It's got to be more than that. There we go, all the way around.
So just a quick example of shaping the behavior of the pigeon to do a 360. So a video in Canvas provides more of an explanation of the difference between the two. And once again, here's this graphic that helps keep you organized. In class, this is when I'd ask for questions. But we'll stop there and see you next time.